Good afternoon, everyone, and before we begin another episode of the Wandering Scribe book impressions, I just want to give a huge thank you and shout out to my good friend and fellow author, Jaegar, for this book. Now, maybe you remember Jaegar. She was featured back on the channel many, many years ago, and in her first ever debut interview, we were talking about her upcoming book of Light and Darkness. Well, I am so happy to announce that I have my very own copy of Light and Darkness, and I am super excited to read it here on the show for you all for this month's Wandering Scribe book impressions. Now, what is of Light and Darkness? Well, according to the author, Arturias Artur Sigurdsson lives a quiet, sheltered life in the village of Trivaden, content with the simple joys and the steadfast love of his parent, Ygrayne and Thelric. But when Thelric vanishes on a routine trip into Falkhearth, the great city of Fjälland region, everything begins to unravel. His father's absence stirs unsettling questions, and a chance encounter with a sharp-tongued, captivating outsider named Lovisa reveals a truth long condemned to grief and subjugation. Ygrayne grapples with her increasingly inquisitive son and her need to protect him, seeking counsel from a close friend and a sworn servant to the folk of Skana, those who remember the world once was. For Skana was not always broken. Once a land of vibrant culture, magic, and divine reverence, Skana fell but 2 centuries ago, when the Valeriaan Empire reclaimed power, an ancient clan whose ire and pride know no equal, declaring the throne of the Allfather is and always was rightfully theirs. In the aftermath of the war, Skana was stripped of her entire identity, her history, and the magic that once flowed freely in belief and mystery alike. Unbeknownst to them, an age-old power struggle is rekindling. As a prophecy whispers itself back into the world among hushed tongues, Artur finds himself unwittingly in the midst. He will have to decide whether he will be a boy shaped by grief or rise to become what the whole of Skana desperately needs him to be. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's dive right into Jaegar's of Light and Darkness, Book 1. The night should have been the pinnacle of peace and tranquility, a display of undisturbed harmony and unmatched beauty. But the stars gleaming in their blanket of darkness could hardly be seen on this evening. The common folk wondered if the very night shuddered at the sight which awaited its return, defying its natural occurrence for its own sanity. It would be forever remembered as a night of despair and despondency, a point of which Skana herself could not recover, the beginning of a display of tyranny that would ravage the continent with unbridled carnage and unrestrained hate, carried out by those who sought vindication for perceived wrongs. The prior years had been long and woeful, and now the worst had finally come to pass. The Valerians and their allies conquered their adversaries, proving themselves victors as they inflicted grief on the world they felt was rightfully theirs, and had been denied to them for far too long. They acted well on their threats of retribution, and were keen on taking complete advantage of the spoils war now afforded them. But it was not gold or treasure, they thought. No, no, no. It was fire. It was cleansing. It was the unmitigated devastation of a world they wanted to punish, as they had once been punished themselves. The first undertaking in a great saga of wrath. The epicenter of what transpired was a city which prided itself on being the heart of knowledge, boasting the largest library in all of Skana. This library held every book and transcript that had ever been written, its many levels forming a pillar that reached to the sky. The privileged visitors who patronaged this monolith of material proclaimed rather dramatically, but in all seriousness, that it would take more than a lifetime to peruse every book on every shelf, and even an attempt did not guarantee the success of such a feat, and those who did indeed try were left unsettled and discontented in the afterlife. Heimdall was the great city's name, home of the proud and reclaimed Northern clan, whose ancestry could be traced back to the once wild and ruthless Vikings. These arbiters of knowledge descended from barbarians, as the city's inhabitants boasted, unknowingly made themselves the ultimate target of what was soon to befall the land, catching the wandering eye of the Valerian's wrath. The fateful night fell. Heimdall, riddled with corpses of its erstwhile denizens and foreigners, had already been laid to ruin by the war, rendered a mere shadow of its former beauty and splendor, once known throughout the whole of Skana. All that remained was the towering library, left predominantly untouched in the midst of the devastation around it. But the appearance of its salvation was purposeful, and very much short-lived, as would soon become clear, for the Valerians were meticulous in their exacting their enduring retribution. The tower had bore witness to and served as a prominent symbol of what the Skana folk had accomplished from clansman civilization, and its downfall was much more than the mere destruction of an imposing structure. Even its reputation and the ideas represented were no match for the flame of the torches carried by the soon-to-be antagonists. Yet despite its impending doom, an unescapable fate, there was something furtive at work, a force of which no Valerian had been even tenuously aware, a force witnessed by only that which dwelt within the walls of the library. When the Valerians made their way up the grand steps, flames their weapons, they were still none the wiser. As their hands grasped the handles of the elegant wooden doors fitted into stone walls, there was a sudden flash of light which swept through the inner recesses of the library, a swell of white that travelled, as one might imagine, a visible echo, an iridescent shine that put even the sun's rays to shame. From floor to pinnacle it travelled amongst the levels of shelves and books, until at last it dispersed as an ocean wave parting against a stony shoreline, a ghostly apparition vanishing as suddenly as it appeared. When the door swung open, all traces of this phenomenal happening had already departed, leaving no evidence of its presence. The Valerians carried out with their mission to deeply wound the folk of Skana for generations to come. The soldiers moved swiftly about the obelisk, reaching all corners so the fire would neglect no single book, leave no segment unscathed. There was no sating the hunger of the flames once they had been, but licked the spines of the books, and they feasted on those cherished pages with a terrifying ravenousness, melting away the elegant covers and engulfing the adjoining occupants upon the shelves. What had taken ages to produce took only moments to destroy. The works created as a result of many lifetimes of commitment destroyed, perishing without any protest. The Valerians stood and observed long enough to ensure the fire would continue to spread, that it would soon consume the entirety of the building around them. When at last the second floor caught fire, the flames lapping eagerly at the precious materials, they retreated to the city. The Valerians' weapon of choice might have been fire, but even they themselves were not immune to its fatal embrace. They withdrew upon their steeds of white beyond the city limits, into the hills surrounding Heimdall's borders. There they were awarded the most magnificent of sights, the beauty of their doing a spectacle for them to observe with a voracious eagerness. The destruction claimed almost the full duration of the evening, but for the Valerians the interval passed all too quickly. The library, which towered high above Heimdall, which once bestowed upon the land of Skana an elegant and conversant gaze, soon found itself completely engulfed in the flames that would bring about its demise. At last the tower would join the rest of her city and her folk. The olden tales goes that the spire could be seen for miles, making even the mountains envy its standing. Travelers lost in the Icelands needed only to look for the library, and it always set their paths aright. That night was no different. The library could be seen as the fire rose high and burned brightly with all it claimed in its gluttonous jowls. As the wooden interior succumbed to devastations, the stone exterior began to collapse, slowly and certainly. Stone by stone, the tower revealed, the flames devouring its innards, spouting smoke to the clouds above. A blanket of darkness completely and utterly consumed a sky where the stars and the moons herself were on the cusp of arriving. Those who were privileged enough to have escaped their own demise during the war were the unfortunate witness of the aftermath. What they observed was the unrelenting obliteration of their homeland, the fall of all they knew, the rhythms of their lives shattered beyond repair. What the Valerians saw, however, was not despair, but a much awaited reckoning. The hues of the ravenous inferno were only the commencement of something much bigger, something much more devastating to come. As the dark smoke stretched across the already tarnished sky, a never-ending sea of black, a comparable glow appeared in the distance. There was but one at the beginning to the east, the rising of flames consuming yet another dwelling called home by Skana folk. Then came another to the west, and at last to the north. The horizon was lit by an uniting orange glow, which made the whole of the whole world look as though it had been cast to the purging flames. To spectators, the fire appeared to be isolated incidents, though this was hardly the truth of the matter. They could only watch their respective lands perishing before their very eyes. But in truth, the entirety of Skana was set alight. The major cities, villages, towns, every place folk once called home, the centerpieces of olden kingdoms and past empires, would be but the graveyards of a history meant to be scorned or lost altogether. Entire livelihoods were upturned as the zenith of the darkest of times began to announce itself. Spreading ash and suffocating smoke, the flames could be felt no matter the distance they were observed from. The lush green land and the rich browns of the surrounding mountains emerged at dawn in a coat of gray. The fresh waters were tainted, the sky set to the farcical appearance of night. No one could recall if the day had indeed retired completely by the time the smoke engulfed the sky above, nor could they recall if the night had indeed taken upon its dominion in the subsequent hours. All that was remembered was the bite of flames, the choking ash in the air around them, and the stains of tears of blackened faces as the entirety of Skana wept helplessly. It was all they could do, weep for what was lost and what would never return. The spoils of war had been given to those who should never have prevailed. When at last the spire of the library collapsed upon itself, all of Skana lit up once more as though life was breathed yet again in the ravenous flames consuming her. Wood cracked and the library's foundation fell upon the city below, with such force that it could be felt throughout the land. The Valerians spoke of how marvelous the sight truly was, observing the structures within its final moments. With delight they recounted the thunderous crack of stones and debris, told of the fire suddenly growing with an intensity achieved by the sheer power of the structure's collapse. A wave of flame and cinders dispersed throughout what was left of Heimdall. Neither soldier nor horse flinched as they felt it brush against their skin and pierce their ears, blinding them momentarily. It was all part of the spectacle. Skana burned so fiercely that olden tales speak of how neither moon nor the sun appeared on their respective horizons for many a day. They refused to lay eyes upon the bloodshed awaiting their unblinking gazes. Hardly anyone could blame the deities, the representatives of all that was good and natural, of peace and serenity. The skies remained a sickly black, and the clouds a dirty brown. Ash continued to fall akin to rain on the living folk, the scorched bodies of those they once called family and friends, and the dwellings they had called home. Skana herself was weeping beside her folk. She could hardly avert her gaze from the butchery that had transpired, and she had all seen what she had always seen all. She was witness to many great things. She had witnessed to man's greatest moments, as she was to his pitfalls, both folks' capacity for sacrifice and the folly in their character. She had seen many a war, many an empire fall at the land and hand of another poised to take its place, but this This was a devastation of catastrophic proportions never previously achieved. Skana was distraught as she felt the pain and despair of the folk just coming to know the true meaning of the word. And she also felt every bit of anger consuming the Valerians. The sentiments of passion that drove them to enact such a sin without hesitation, without remorse. It was in those coming days that she too finally wept, tears which extinguished the remaining flames cast about the land, looking for more to feed upon in such a barrenness. It was her tears which brought an end to it all, and though the land burned no more, what her tears could not heal was the unseen toll upon her folk, and the repercussions it would have for an already uncertain future. There was no remedy, even given all her might, that could never heal such a wound. The folks called the tragedy Mordun, the Black Dawn, to memorialize the sorrow of Skana, to remember the time they wept in solidarity with one another. It was the end of a world they once knew, and the beginning of one that will not let them forget the victor's capacity for ire. That was over 200 years ago, and the Valerians are as much in power now as they ever were then. Their despotic reign is the bane of all prosperity and contentment of the common folk, which live in fear of the empire, all too quick to punish and all too obliged to the unforgiving. The common folk live in a world with a past torn away from them and a future long faded from sight, a world in which most knowledge and skills are forbidden to them, the promise of prosperity left only to those who laid claim to the spoils of war. But that does not stop them from longing. It's all they have left. While the many can only hope there will come an end to the Valerians, others have taken their courage and raised a blade in a stoic defiance. It was on the day preceding the fall of Heimdall as the common folk gazed upon the ruins they once called home with both heaviness and hearts and an indignation thought to be possessed only by the Valerians, that a glimmer of hope appeared. It was a call, a beckoning to action, to take up arms ever so defiantly in opposition to the newly formed empire. They called themselves the Oath-bound, for they did make an oath to resist the Valerian reign just as they had in olden times, as they always would, no matter what the future held. But oaths were a disregarded concept left behind in the ages in which men gave their lives the most sacred of promises, to uphold the word so valiantly pledged. The Valerians sneered at this concept, at a notion they confidently deemed archaic and foolish. What was used as an expression to deride the folk of a region thought to be an uncivilized barbaric nature, now was proclaimed loudly upon the tongues who adopted what would become a title, a legacy, for Heimdall. For the folk who were denigrated because of the circumstances they were born into, for the folks who had taken up arms against the Valerians in olden times, for the homeland which birthed a defiance, a rebellion was formed of unlikely heroes, the hearts amongst the common folk that responded to the call. The two adversaries had stood at odds with one another for over 200 years, and the Oathbound remained the last hope of the common folk of Skana. Though they may not outwardly display support due in part to the grave consequences, it had not stopped the commoners from furtively yearning in the shadows, behind closed doors, in the company of trusted parties, for the victory that had been lost to them all those years ago. Chapter 1. It began again, as at every morning from the dawn of time. The darkness extended a gracious hand, and from the depths of night pulled forth the coming morning. The vibrant colors of a soft gradient pushed back the blanket of stars that once ruled the sky. The sun had not yet peaked, nor did it, too, for the mountains to become almost monstrous silhouettes overlooking a vast landscape of forest and plains that were still asleep, quiet and serene in the present dormancy. Only when the snow-riddled peaks began to glisten of gold, and the rays of the morning star began to extend their own hands across this vast landscape, did it begin to awake. Creatures of the night took to slumber, relinquishing their nocturnal domain for the time being, and the land became alive in a completely new way. The morning dew, akin to a blanket of crystal, glistened on the brush with an almost iridescent glow. splashing a touch of bright color in contrast to the gentle browns and greens of the forest. The forest fairies, who fluttered about in gleaming magenta, began to flit away in the coming light. The birds ruffled awake with a fluff of their plumage, twittering about up high within the trees, unseen as they sang and danced and filled the forest with a harmonic melody. The stags stretched their elegant legs and sharpened their equally elegant horns before they began to roam. When the moonlight once pierced through the trees to the depths of the forest floor below, now that the sunlight, in these early morning hours when the land had only just stretched to life once again, came the eager footsteps of a young boy walking about the trail he had traversed with his father many times before. Beginning in the garden of their home, it was a trail he knew well and found comfort in traveling alone. As of recently did he take this walk in his own company, bucket and fishing pole in hand, to try for the morning catch down by the river not too far from his village, Trivaden. He was the important age of 12, and thus, in the midst of seeking as much independence as he could be granted, to become the young man he thought himself already, one no longer in need of the determined support or guidance of his parents. He thought himself a quick learner and possessed a level headed upon his shoulders, the teachings throughout his childhood having done well to shape his temperament and inform the decisions he made. It was just fishing, after all, his favorite hobby, nearly second nature at that point, and he would always stay to the path his father marked for him, even when traversing a forest with which he was well acquainted with, whose atmosphere was peaceful and undisturbed by any predators that elsewhere posed terrifying threats. His name was Arturias Sigurdsson, but he preferred the nickname Artur. He felt it suited him better. A thicket of raven black hair framed his face, his peachy skin often flushed with youthful excitement. His bangs bounced over his forehead, lending him his boyish charm. As he marched down the beaten path worn by the constant trips to and fro, dark eyebrows lifted above large gray eyes, which were full of delight and the vivacity youth afforded. They were a tad greener today, with glints of brown in the iris, and they often were on days he went fishing, and when the days grew warmer his mood particularly high. Both parents flippantly commented, but with slight suspicion that it was due to the hobby being associated with his father, who himself possessed deep green eyes. It was when the moon returned to the sky darkened that the boy's eyes would revert to deep gray. His mother, who possessed eyes of fathomless blue, the abyss of an ocean, wished she saw a bit of herself in Arthur's gaze. Yet never in his 12 years of life had they ever shifted to such a hue, not even the slightest. Just akin to his father, the neighbors would often remark on the stark resemblance to the man they knew as Thelric Sigurdsson. Yet it was his mother, Ygrayne, whose raven-colored hair lay thickly around her, that Arthur inherited his own from. On many a night he would hear them disputing one another's claim as to who he most resembled, but in truth they loved seeing the other in him, and were quick to capitulate. Arthur was generally a jovial young lad, full of vitality and in possession of pleasant, but shy disposition, free-spirited until he needed to listen to his parents, grudgingly deferring to their authority. None of that mattered in the current moment, however. He was about to partake in one of his favorite hobbies, his love of fishing, instilled in him by his father, as he too had a passion for it in its places of peace and simplicity. "Stay to the path your father marked out for you," his mother always called out to him from the kitchen window before he could even reach the tree line behind their home. "I know, mamma," Arthur huffed, doing well to avert his face to hide the blush of embarrassment in his cheeks and the rolling of his eyes. Arthur often mistook Ygrayne's motherly instincts and well-meaning concerns for nagging, given his unwavering opinion that he already knew how to tend to himself. It was again just fishing. "Better watch that mouth," Ygrayne would mutter under her breath in response to Arthur's cheekiness. And on that note, we are going to be stopping here. Now, I am super excited to begin reading this book. Just from the onset, it reminds me of another good book of a similar tempo, and that is The Silent Witness by my good friend and fellow author Kim Applegrim. Now, just from the prologue and the first part of chapter 1, this is truly high epic fantasy from the language, the description, the beat. It lays everything out. It is very lore heavy, I will say in the beginning, but it reads very, very well. And honestly, I think if you enjoy books like Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings, or if you're a fan, I should say, Brandon Sanderson, you will definitely love Of Light and Darkness. This easily gets another 4 to 5. Actually, I will go even further and say a 5 out of 5, because this is a book I've been waiting for a very long time. So, if you would like to order yourself a copy, I will link it down below in the description of this video. And if you'd like to learn more about Rye and her first ever author interview, I will also attach it at the top above. Thank you everyone for joining us for another amazing episode here on the channel, and we will see you all next time. And until then, this has been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill. Wish you all a wonderful day wherever you are in the world. Take care, and see you all next week.